All right, I'm taking our prayer this morning from Psalm 25, verses 6 and 7. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Be mindful of your mercy, O Lord, and of your steadfast love, for they have been from of old. Remember not the sins of our youth or our transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember us for the sake of your goodness, O Lord. Amen. Well, this is our third lesson in our series on the lament psalms. And let's just review quickly what we did the first 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, we did a kind of an overview of the book of Psalms. We noticed that Psalms is a little bit like a combination of our hymn book and our prayer book that was used by ancient Israel. We noticed that there were Psalms written by a number of different people over a long period of time, starting with David around 1000 BC and all the way down to the Babylonian exile and their return when they came back from exile around 536. So about 5 centuries of time where the Psalms were being written and put together. And we noticed that there were many different types of Psalms included. Psalms of praise, Psalms for the king, and especially laments. And the laments are the largest category in the Psalms. And then last week we looked in more detail at some of the laments. We noticed that they usually arose out of a period of crisis or trouble in the life of an individual. We also noticed that the Psalms are not just moaning and wailing and crying, but there's a pattern to most of the Psalms. And they would often state their complaint, what it is that's happening, that's wrong. They would have a petition where they want God to do something about this. And finally, they praise God because they believe God will do something to change things. You know, there would be little use to praying to God if you didn't really think God could do anything. And so they believed God could. And that was the whole purpose of the lament, to try to get God to act on their behalf, but also to pour out their own feelings of injustice and trouble. Now, this week, I want to look more specifically at another type of lament. And then in the last part of the lesson, we'll look at the Psalms that are called the imprecatory Psalms. That's just a big word that means the Psalms of vengeance, the Psalms of calling down a curse on your enemy. You want something bad to happen to them. And those are some of the most troubling Psalms, some of the ones that we have a hard time knowing what to do with. So we're going to talk a little bit about those at the end of class today. Now, the laments that we studied last week are primarily where one person is crying out in the midst of some crisis. And those are called the individual laments, because as the name implies, it's one person or one individual crying out to God. And you can usually recognize these by the language that is used. For example, and I'll just read a couple of verses from Psalm 3. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there's no help for you in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts up my head. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy hill. Well, you can hear in just those few verses how many singular pronouns, I, me, are used there. So that's where the term individual lament comes from. And the majority of the laments are of that type, the individual lament. But there's a second type that we're going to look at a bit today, and those are called the community laments. And that's where there is some threat to the whole community. And so they cry out to God for help, for deliverance. And in those, you often see the plural, the pronoun we or us. Psalm 12, verse 7 says, "You, O Lord, will protect us. You will guard us from this generation forever." So it's that plural, it's that sense of community. And in the ancient world, community was extremely important. The world could be a very harsh and a very hostile place. And there were few of society's safety nets that we have around us today. No hospitals, no emergency rooms, no EMS, no local police, no local fire department, none of the social services for the poor. So people didn't have any of those things to rely on. They really had to rely on their community. They really had to work together in times of crisis and in times of trouble. They had to support each other. So you were a part of a community. That was a part of your identity. You were a member of a family. You were a member of the clan, the village, ultimately the tribe, and finally the nation. But all of those were sort of circles of your widening community. And it was important for the community to come together to help each other in times of trouble. People really did have to band together in a way that's quite different from what we do today. You had status, you had protection, you had identity as a member of the community. And without community, you really were at the mercy of strangers and enemies. There were the various things that bound them together. There was the covenant with the same God that all of the members were a part of. There was worship at the temple. There was the common things that they did, like observing the Sabbath, following the law. All of those things bound them together. But without this, you were adrift in a pretty hostile and dangerous world. So the community laments express that sense of togetherness or community in the face of a crisis. And one of the community laments that I want us to look at in a little bit of detail is Psalm 44. And I know there are Bibles sort of scattered around, and if you would like to turn to Psalm 44, I think this would be helpful for us to look at this and get a sense of what's going on here. And we're going to take this in a few small chunks, so we won't have too much all at once here. But beginning in Psalm 44, listen for the language of how the psalmist first sort of remembers what God has done for them in the past, and that becomes the foundation for asking God to do something now. Would someone read just the first 8 verses nice and loud so everybody could hear it?
Our fathers have told us what deeds thou didst perform in their days, in the days of old. Thou with thine own hand didst drive out the nations, but them thou didst plant, thou didst afflict the peoples, but them thou didst set free.
Okay? So in those opening verses, the psalmist is sort of recounting how God has delivered them in the past. He brought them into this land, defeated their enemies, and has been with them. So that's kind of the foundation. He's laying that, and then he's going to turn to what's happening in the present and why they need God to help them again. So if someone else maybe would read starting with verse 9 and just 9 through 16, again nice and loud so everybody can hear.
Yet thou hast cast us off and abased us, and hast not gone out with our armies. Thou hast made us turn back from the foe, and our enemies have gotten spoil. Thou hast made us like sheep for slaughter, and hast scattered us among the nations. Thou hast sold thy people for a trifle, demanding no high price for them. Thou hast...
All right, so what's happening now? What's the psalmist's complaint at this point? Well, he mentions several things there. What does he say about the armies?
Well, God's doing just the opposite of what he did in the first section.
Exactly. It's just the opposite of the first part, isn't it? Now, instead of helping them to win victories, now God is not with the army. The army is being defeated. They're being abused. They're being taken away. Now, it's not specific. It doesn't tell us, this was in this battle in this particular year. It doesn't tell us exactly when, but it's pretty clear there's a defeat at the hands of their enemies. So they're having all kinds of problems at this point. So this, yes, Charles.
What's interesting to me is it's God's doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not our enemies are overtaking us. Thou hast left.
Yeah, God has allowed this to happen to them. Exactly. So that's part of the problem. Why? And that sort of leads us then to the conclusion. And I'm going to skip a few verses. And if you'll skip down and just look at the very end, beginning about verse 23, if I could get someone to read 23 through 26.
For our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our body cleaves to the ground. Rise up, come to our help. Deliver us for the sake of thy steadfast love.
All right. So listen to the language here, and this is the language that the psalmist is using to try to get God's attention and get God to do something about this. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep? Is God asleep? Well, it looks like it from their perspective. God's not doing anything. So you call on God to wake up. Don't sleep on the job. Rouse yourself. Why do you hide your face? My son had to deal with a situation not too long ago where a guy was sleeping on the job. And this is a security department, so sleeping on the job is not good. It was, he had to be fired. So God is, from their perspective, God is sleeping on the job, and this is not acceptable. This is not good. He's asleep. Wake up. Why do you hide your face? Why are you turning and not seeing what's going on? So there's all this graphic language to try to get God's attention and to try to motivate God to do something about this. So that's the language of the community lament. And this is something that threatens not just the individual, but it threatens the whole community. And so they're really desperate to get God's attention. And that's what we see in many of the community laments. But as I said, in many cases, we can't identify exactly what the crisis was or when the particular crisis was, because they had enemies and they had battles. If you read through the book of Kings, you'll see that there are many, many different battles against their enemies. And so it's not always easy to identify exactly which time they're talking about. But occasionally, we get one with a bit more detail that we can be more certain about. And one of those is Psalm 74. And if you want to turn to 74, we'll look at that as just another quick example of a community lament about something that threatens their existence. All right, and I'm just going to pick out a few key points here. It opens in verse 1, God, why do you cast us off forever? They feel like God's abandoned them. Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? And then it calls on God in verse 2, remember your congregation. Don't forget us. And again, a couple of lines later, remember Mount Zion, where you came to dwell. Mount Zion is in Jerusalem. It's the site of the temple. And the temple, of course, represented God's presence with His people. So that was important to the whole community. And then, starting in verse 3, he says, direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in the sanctuary. Your foes have roared within your holy place. They've set up their emblems there. At the upper entrance, they hacked the wooden trellises with axes. And then with hatchets and hammers, they smashed all its carved work. They set your sanctuary on fire. They desecrated the dwelling place of your name, bringing it to the ground. What do you suppose he's describing there? Hear that language about sanctuary and dwelling place? What's he referring to?
Destruction of the temple.
I think he's referring to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And we know that happened when the Babylonian army invaded about 586 BC and took many of the people into Babylonian captivity. Now, maybe sometime we'll have a time when we could do maybe a one-lesson chronology of the Old Testament where we could put all these pieces together. That would be fun. But it's about 586 when the Babylonians come, they destroy the temple, take them into captivity. I think that's what he's talking about. So we can be pretty definite about the setting of this particular psalm. And look at the detail about the fire and the hacking of the trellises and the destroying with hammers. Is he giving God kind of a news report on what happened here? No, God of course already knows what's happened, but he's giving those details perhaps in part to keep it fresh in the memory of the people and the next generation who maybe didn't see it happen, but you want them to remember these terrible things that have happened. And the second part might be you sort of give the details to remind God how bad it was and get God to do something about it. So he includes the details, and then in verses 8 and 9, they said to themselves, we will utterly subdue them, and they burned the meeting place of God in the land and destroyed it. And then in verses 10 and 11, he says, if that's not bad enough, we have no prophet to tell us how long this is going to last. That's actually in verses 8 and 9. There's no prophet to tell us how long this will go on. And then in verses 12 through 17, and I know I'm just sort of hitting some highlights here, but in 12 through 17, there's another of those sections where he sort of recounts what God did in the past as maybe the basis for convincing God to act again. And he says, In verse 13, you divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You opened springs and torrents. That language about the dragon and the Leviathan, that's language from the creation stories, God's work at creation, where God defeats the forces of chaos and brings them under control. So he's sort of appealing, God, you did these great things in the past. You defeated supernatural forces. You created the world. So surely you can help us now in this tragedy and help us as we face the Babylonians. So he's appealing to what God did in the past and saying, help us now. And then finally, he says in verse 18, remember, O Lord, calling to mind the past. In verse 20, have regard for your covenant. Remember the promises. And don't let this continue. So this is all about the destruction of the temple and the Babylonian exile. And the temple, of course, was extremely important because it represented the presence of God. It was a symbol of God's presence. It's God who is the real king. God is the ruler from the beginning. God is most important. And so God is called upon to act. In spite of the fact that now the temple is destroyed. But God can still act. God's presence can still be with them. The temple is gone, but they can rely on God because God is not limited to the temple. He's beyond and outside the temple. And perhaps a modern parallel for us might be that sometimes, the way we think about church buildings and places where we meet, and somehow we get the idea that God is limited to this corner or to this building. And I love our building. I think the nave gives us a wonderful sense of awe and respect and reverence. But God is not limited to the nave. As I used to hear in sermons when I was growing up, the church is not the building. And we all know that. This is the church right here. And we can meet in the nave. We can meet on the front lawn. We can even meet on the soccer field, and we're still the church because it's the people. And maybe in a way that's a parallel. God was bigger than the temple. God wasn't limited. So even though the temple was destroyed, they could still look to God for help. They knew they were a part of a community in Israel, and they understood the threat to community. I think sometimes today it's more difficult to identify with a community. Who is our community? Is it our neighborhood? Well, I know a few neighbors, but not very many, and most of us are probably like that. Is it a club? A social group? Is it the church? Well, I hope so. But sometimes it's hard to know exactly what our community is. We did have, I think, a wonderful example of community right here not long ago with Adam's army and the people that were working together to support the Crutherd family when Adam was dealing with his illness. So that was very definitely a sense where the whole community came together in support. But I think the problem of community in some ways goes back to a lesson that Father Sandy taught a few weeks ago about what he called a modern heresy of individualism, where each of us is so doing our own thing that we really don't have a sense of community, and it's hard to relate to that idea. I think even the definition of community is sometimes fluid. Most of us feel a part of a larger group at times, and there are tragedies that affect and impact all of us. There's a lot to lament right here in our own community, right here in Memphis. Unemployment, homelessness, lack of opportunities for a lot of people, crime, a struggling education system. There are a lot of challenges, and we can talk to God about these hurts and these wounds. On a national level, we're impacted sometimes by crises like hurricanes and fires, or even the tragedy in Las Vegas recently. And of course, everyone remembers 9/11 and how for a while, I think that pulled people together with a sense of community. And people went to churches and prayed and felt a part of community. But after a while, that kind of fades away. But I think there's still an important place for community laments where we can express that sense of loss and ask God to guide us. God is there, and I think He wants to hear our prayers. So I think community laments can still be important, but we need to focus on building that sense of community so that we'll have a basis for those. Now, I want to turn for a few minutes to talk about the imprecatory Psalms, those really hard ones where they call for punishment, for judgment on enemies. Those are the ones that are sometimes the most difficult for us to understand. And I'll say here, when we begin to talk about the imprecatory Psalms, we're moving into some pretty deep water. And we won't be able to talk about everything that would be involved in studying those this morning, but we'll just talk about a couple of things that I think will be helpful. Now, last week, we were very fortunate to have Dr. Brueggemann come and speak to us. And he's been very gracious to agree to come back again today. So we're going to hear a brief word from Brueggemann, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this. So,
well, I think the Episcopalians have a phrase about God, Him from whom no secret can be hid. And the Psalms are expressing all of our secrets, and the Psalms believe that we run the full emotional gamut from anger and rage and hate to love and forgiveness and compassion. All of that needs to be voiced. And if some among you have no hates, then do it for the rest of us. Very often, people who are really caring and so on also turn out to be good haters. And the book of Psalms is not censored. It gives you all the raw stuff. And I think that worship ought to be a place where all the raw stuff gets some airtime with God. And it may be that you or you or you or you have no hate, but there's plenty of hate all around us that needs to be carried to God. That's what I think. The good news is we don't have to live censored lives. By and large, what the church has done about our deep negativities is to say you shouldn't feel that way, or if you feel that way, please do it somewhere else, because we're all nice people here. Well, the truth of the matter is, we're not all nice people. Have you heard about how the church is like a football game? It consists in many committee meetings interrupted by spasms of violence. And, you know, churches.
Think about that one.
Churches have that happen among us. And as you know, the earlier part of Psalm 139 says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I am a mystery to myself. And that whole mystery of the self is brought to God. I learned that myself, about myself. Well, I sort of knew it. But I did a long stint of psychotherapy. And you know, I'm a pretty prominent guy, so it's not easy for me to go psychotherapy. And after I had seen this wonderful man for 6 weeks, he said to me, do you want to talk about something serious, or you just want to keep doing this? I think sometimes God may say about our prayers, you want to just keep doing this, or you want to talk about something serious? That's what I think is going on. So it's a very important question.
All right. Well, I think Dr. Brueggemann really hits the target there. The Psalms, especially these Psalms, are where we deal with those really serious things in life and serious thoughts and feelings that we have inside of us. There are 3 Psalms that have been omitted from the church's book of hours. That's the prayers and devotions that are used by groups that pray the hours of the day, starting early in the morning and throughout the day. There are different times of prayer and devotion. There are 3 Psalms that they decided just had to be left completely out. Those are Psalms 58, 83, and 109. I heard someone talking about those once, and they said even the most devoted nuns can't get through 109. It's pretty rough. But those have been left out. And then there are verses here and there of other Psalms that have been omitted because I think in part they don't know what to do with them. I had a colleague once who was a professor of Bible, and he told me, I have a hard time getting through the Psalms because I just don't have any enemies. Well, sometimes I think we might feel that way. What do we do with those? And that is an interesting problem, and we might feel the same way at times. But in some parts of the world, persecution is very real. It's very obvious. There are enemies of the truth. What about those who traffic in human beings, forcing women and children into prostitution? What about the drug cartels that make millions of dollars from the habits that destroy people's lives? Are they enemies of what is good and right? The language about enemies in the Psalms is pretty general, and I think it allows us to apply that in new contexts in our own day. And we do have to remember that the Psalms are poetry. And so some of this language that sounds so harsh and so extreme about the enemies may be hyperbole, it may be exaggeration for effect. And some of us have trouble with poetry. You know, some of us have a harder time getting into poetry than others. I know for myself, I had to work to begin to appreciate poetry. I used to tell my students when I come to poetry, I had 3 strikes against me to start understanding poetry. First, I grew up in a very small town in Texas, and we didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about poetry. Second, I played high school football, and poetry wasn't a topic that we talked about in the locker room. And then when I went to college, I was a mathematics major, and math and poetry are, sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. So I had to work to come to appreciate poetry. Now, there was one interesting thing when I was in school in Texas. The Texas state legislature, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that every student should memorize 50 lines of poetry every year. And so we had to do that. But I can tell you, nothing can kill the love of poetry like sitting in a classroom and hearing 25 students recite Casey at the Bat, one after the other. So I had to work at understanding poetry. But we're all familiar with how poetry has exaggerated language. Even in our everyday speech, we use exaggeration sometimes to make a point. You know, have you ever heard somebody say, "I was so embarrassed I wanted to die"? Or, "Everybody in Memphis was at the Liberty Bowl." Or, "We slaughtered the other team last night." Or, I love this one, "When he said that, I wanted to strangle him." I think wives use that one a lot, but that's what I've heard. But the Psalms use very exaggerated language sometimes to talk about enemies. Listen, for example, at Psalm 58, just a few verses, and this is one of those Psalms that they decided just had to be left out. Psalm 58, verse 6, "O God, break the teeth in their mouths, tear out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them vanish like water that runs away. Like grass, let them be trodden down and wither. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, like the ultimate untimely birth that never sees the sun." Those are all the horrible things that the psalmist is wishing on his enemies. So, what do we do with that? Well, in the ancient world, there were terrible atrocities that happened in war, in other situations, atrocities that drove people to cry out in rage. Psalm 137 is perhaps the most shocking of all of these. And we're going to look at Psalm 137 for just a minute, if you want to turn there. And one key point to remember in the Psalms is that there is a wish for justice. People feel like they have been terribly wronged, and so they're calling on God to set things right. The psalmist, now in Psalm 137, it'll be pretty clear, the psalmists don't have power to do anything about this injustice themselves. The people in Psalm 137 have no army. They have no political power. They can't bring about justice. And so they're calling on God to do something to right this terrible wrong. So let's look at Psalm 137 just a second and think about this and the graphic language, perhaps in part to keep this tragedy in the minds of the people so that the next generation doesn't forget how horrible this was. Now the first part starts, and we're okay with the first part. "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept, when we remembered Zion." So I think it's pretty clear. They're in Babylonian exile. They've been taken away from Jerusalem, and they're remembering what it was like back there. "On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there in Babylon our captors ask us for songs. Our tormentors ask for mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' You know, if it's so great, let's hear one of your songs. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Oh, that is beautiful. I know we could all identify with those rich feelings of remembering their home. So if the psalm stopped right there, we'd be fine. And in fact, when it's usually read in public, that's exactly what they do. They stop right there. And we're all good with that. But the psalm doesn't stop there. There's more. And that's where we have the problem. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, that's their next door neighbors, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down to its foundations. So the Edomites, they're cheering on the Babylonians while they're destroying everything. And then, O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. And then that haunting last line, happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. Perhaps these are people who have really seen horrible things exactly like this. And unfortunately, atrocities still happen. They happen in war, but not only in war. They happen all around us, even right here in Memphis. Children are shot. Parents see their children killed right in front of them. Terrible things happen. How are people going to respond? Well, we might say, well, they shouldn't be so vindictive. They shouldn't be so harsh as the psalmist is here. Well, but what if we do feel like that? What do we do with those feelings? The psalmists are showing us the real feelings of real people in the face of terrible crises. Now, most of us are not in that situation. Most of us don't see shootings in our neighborhood or in our living room. We don't have to deal with those kinds of things, but we may have other things that make us angry, that make us have feelings of wishing harm or wishing ill to someone. It might be an unreasonable boss or a supervisor that you just can't please, that is constantly on your case, and you might secretly think, boy, I wish he would get what he deserves. I wish something bad would happen to that person. I'm sure none of us would think that, but it could happen. Or it might be someone has slighted you or insulted you for no reason. It might even be something as trivial as somebody cuts you off in traffic and you wish ill on that person. You wish harm to come to them. So, we all understand how those feelings could come about. And if we feel that way, what do we do with it? What do we do with those feelings? And here, I have one more guest appearance from Dr. Brueggemann that's going to talk about that very thing. So let's listen, and then we'll wrap things up.
The fifth element that hasn't come up in these Psalms, but I do want to comment on it, and that is the vengeance. One of the objections to these Psalms is that they really want God to get the guys that have done it. So the best case for that I know is in Psalm 58. Psalm 58:6. You can imagine saying this, and then your psychotherapist says, is there anything else you'd like to say? Yes! And he goes again. 58:6, oh God, break the teeth in their mouth. And you could just, in a nice congregation, you can see doing this and you say, the word of the Lord, thanks be to God. Oh God, break the teeth in their mouth Tear out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them vanish like water that runs away, like grass that's trodden down. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into the slime, into the untimely birth that never sees the sun. Sooner than your pots can feel the heat of thorns, whether green or blaze, may he be swept away. Now, the word is that Christians ought not to use these psalms because Christians ought not to feel that way. Agreed. But what do you feel that way? We do have, from time to time, yearnings for vengeance. So the question is, not should we feel that way, the question is, if you feel that way, what are you going to do with it? And I can think of only 3 things you can do with your thirst for vengeance. You can act it out, get a gun. We're seeing that. But people like us wouldn't do that. You can deny it. But what happens when you deny it, it tends to come out somewhere else that you didn't plan on, in your family or somewhere else. The third thing you can do, which is what Freud understood so well, you can give it over to your therapist, you can give it over to God. And I propose that's what they're doing in these Psalms. They're saying, I am being eaten alive by my anger, and I'd like to hand it off to you. Well, parents tend to know about this. 2 siblings are playing in the backyard, and one of them hurts the other one, and the problem is that the parent doesn't really know who initiated it. But the one who has a little scratch with a little blood comes into the house, and like a psalmist, must use great hyperbole to get mother's attention that if you don't do something quickly, I'm going to die from this blood. You do get exaggerated speech. And you do a Band-Aid, and you think you've gotten it taken care of, but then he says, what are you gonna do about him? I'll not be happy till you punish him for what he did to me. A wise parent does not say, you can't talk that way about your brother. A wise parent does not say, wait a minute, let me write this down so that I can do it. A wise parent says, why don't you leave that to me? I have heard you, and now you can leave it with me, and I'll decide what needs to be done. I think that's how these Psalms, at their best, work. And the recovery of the thirst for vengeance in the Psalter, it seems to me to be an important project in the life of the church. Otherwise, people, and particularly young people, don't know that we know about that stuff. And we have known about that stuff forever. And we have devised ways of processing it to health.
All right. Well, I think that's a wonderful illustration of what we do with those. And perhaps the Psalms of Vengeance are there, at least in part, to show us how to express these feelings, to get them out in the open, to begin to deal with them, rather than act them out. In the Psalms of Vengeance, we take our anger not into the streets like a mob, not to the internet where we can rant against people we disagree with, but we take them to God where we can leave them. And we may have to do that again and again. as we take it to God until we finally are able to be done with it and leave it there. And I think the Psalms of Vengeance show us one way that we can do that. All right, well, questions or observations about anything we've talked about this morning? That's a great illustration. And I think the Psalms, if we really understand them, help us to see that just because we have feelings like that, it doesn't mean we have to leave. You know, like he said, take it somewhere else. No, it's okay. You can stay and be a part of us and work through it as a part of the church. Yes, Hester.
As I look at our society,
Or is it just me?
No, I think that's exactly right. It's that dialogue, that relationship that's built on two-way communication, and I think that's extremely important. So you're right. It's not just simply getting it off our chest, but I think it's realizing that we can express those things to God, and He can hear us, like the last clip said. He hears us, and then we can let Him decide what to do about it. So I think that's very, very good. Other thoughts? Well, I've enjoyed this 3-week series very much. I appreciate your attention, and we've got worship coming up in just a few minutes, so thanks very much.